Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
Okay, well, we know the title of the webinar. That was already published very well, but I want to move straight on to slide 2, which is an interesting observation I've made throughout the various academic and practitioner research I've been involved in. Slide 2 is, if we look to the left, how come it is 60 years later on we're still seeing the same sort of statistic being quoted in terms of change initiatives not delivering what the stakeholders are really looking for? I originally started my research thinking this was maybe the past 10 or 15 years, and as I dug further into the academic research, I came across papers dating back to the late 1950s, and what was fascinating, the conclusions were really not that significantly different to what we find today. And the language obviously has changed over the time, but the essence of what was being communicated. I recently presented at an event, a conference for the Association of Project Managers, and I'm sitting in front of 120 people, and I'm saying, and I include myself in this mix, maybe we should reflect. If we've spent 60 years, 2 to 3 generations, and actually not making a major impact on success when it comes to change, or at least how we perceive success, there might be a case that we're missing something. Maybe we're pulling the wrong levers. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to actually kick off. What we'll cover, I'll do a brief introduction on the research. I conducted that back in the UK, and we concluded in 2012. This was academic research. And then following that, I then spent a further 2 to 3 years exploring it more from a practitioner perspective. The academic view is very helpful, and I would suggest essential, but as is also the practitioner. So it's about bringing the two together and integrating them. And then finally, I've got a few items to share with you which you can take away. They're no-charge items. You can choose to engage with them if they're of interest to you, to try and look at change from a different perspective. So there are 3 distinct areas we'll go through. There's much more behind each of these sections, so if you are interested, feel free to contact me, and those details will be available at the end. Okay, first item. What we have here, this will be a statement that many of you have seen before, I'm sure. It's talking about the 70% change. If you want to dig further there, then what we have is a link for one of the Harvard Business Review reports, but you will find a lot of information talking about this. People like Deloitte, PwC, and many other consultancies also publish papers. So you have academic as well as practitioner. But what's interesting is resistance to change specifically seems to pop up at an ever-increasing rate as to one of the reasons behind it. And I found that fascinating. That so what is resistance? We know our lives seem to be changing forever. It's a turbulent market. We're trying to do more with less. That's certainly true in the European context. I'm not sure if that is always the case. If you go to sort of areas in the Far East, then they have many resources, but the task is how to bring them together effectively. But the bottom line is we have turbulent market conditions globally. If we perceive we have resistance to change as a major issue, then it's going to hold everyone back in some form or other, and that's really what drew me to this space. The research, so this is the academic research, consisted of 16 change leaders, both past and present, so some were still active CEOs of large corporates in London, some had been in those types of positions, and some were program managers. Between them, they represented 55 organizations. And in terms of the sectors that those people represented, it was across oil and gas, professional services, public sector, and including public services such as district councils and police collaboration program, which was integrating 2 areas. So quite a broad mix, and I wanted to not fall into a trap of researching one sector. I wanted to try and get cross-sector information. The high-level findings, as I say, there's a paper behind the details here if you're interested, which we won't go into today, but the high-level findings is that we actually categorized 518 separate statements which came from these interviews, and from there were 18 change symptoms, resistance to change symptoms that kept appearing. And so we then started to collect them together, and what we really did is we grouped them into 3 major areas, major themes, with some subheadings. So we have the task of leading and managing change, which comprises of purpose, communications, and the change dynamic, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. leading and managing individual and group transition. That's an interesting space. Some people, this language may be new to people. That's one of the reasons I'm sharing it. It's actually not new to the domain of knowledge. It's been around since the 70s. It's not typically taught, however, which is quite fascinating. And then you have this third area, which is ensuring a safe environment to enable learning and change. There's a lot of psychological research, as well as practitioner experience, that if you put people in a stressful or fearful situation, the learning outcomes, the value add from a learning experience is generally quite low. And one of the challenges change brings with it is the need to learn, to do things differently. So if the environment is such that people don't feel that they can learn, then they probably will not change so readily. And underneath we've got these codes, RTC, they stand for resistance to change, and there are 18 symptoms. So what we've done is we've taken the 18 symptoms and then we've allocated them by these group headings. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, other than I want to give you a different perspective on this. We took those symptoms and we said, well, okay, if we move them into everyday language, and as well as some of the popular books that are out there in the marketplace, how might those symptoms manifest themselves? Where would we see them? So you see at the top here we have purpose. This is a model that we've created. It's an organizational dynamics model. So there will be other variations of that out in the marketplace, which is fine. We're all effectively saying a similar thing. But back to the resistance subject, what we found was there was a lack of clear purpose in many of the change initiatives that were not as successful. The ones that were successful, purpose was absolutely clear. People knew where they were heading. They had a guiding star behind them. Leadership, low awareness regarding leadership of transformation and individual transition. We'll look a bit more into what those terms mean later on. Another topic that popped up, different modes of management. Think of this in terms of how we perceive the same information. Again, we'll explore that further on later on in the presentation. But modes of management, people come into their leadership of managerial roles and change leadership roles, and they'll have a particular approach, and their perspective will directly impact what they perceive, and what they perceive will directly impact their behaviors. And given change is often about behavioral change, that is actually quite an important component piece, and often not included in change initiatives. I won't go through all of these. These slides will be available for you to read. Really, it was about saying we've taken the 518 themes from the 55 change initiatives, we grouped them, we then applied them to an organizational dynamics model, and then from there you can start to see some classic language that we might hear when we look at traditional resistance to change or change management reports. This was another slice that we applied. We wanted to say, well, okay, if we're missing something, back to my point at the beginning, are we pulling the wrong lever here for change to be successful? I'd come across, based on some other study, when I was exploring behavioral change specifically, a structure which is known as logical levels or psychological levels. It has many names, actually. It's conceived by a gentleman who's now passed. That's Gregory Bateson, an English guy who was working for many, many years in America, and then adapted by a chap called Robert Dilts, and their work has now got into other publications. So if you want a current publication, there's a particular one on the right-hand side here by Hardingham that starts to talk about this space. But what we said was, well, what if miscommunication is a clear part of change? Sorry, communication is a clear part of change needs. If miscommunication is taking place, I wonder if that could be further complicating the issue. So what we then did is we said, well, okay, if we take this basic model of psychological levels or logical levels, and then we mapped each of the resistance to change symptoms that had come out of our research, and let's see where they fall in terms of the type of language being used and the topic being discussed. And what was fascinating, the majority were actually below this red line, which was in the belief, sense of identity and beyond identity area. And in the UK system, for sure, that is an area that managers and leaders are not traditionally helped to explore, to develop their skills, to develop self-awareness and awareness of others. So there's this strange phenomena that the very area that we are not typically trained to explore is actually representing a large percentage of symptoms that came through resistance to change. And that left us wondering, well, is there a relationship between leaders and managers' ability to work at a deeper psychological level, be this consciously or otherwise? Some people are just natural at this space, others are not. But it is a skill, and the skills can be learnt. And so I started to think, I wonder if this is a play in really a systemic weakness in our ability to achieve successful change. If you map it back to this earlier model that I shared with you, the organizational dynamics model we created, another way of looking at this is you can draw this line across the center. And those topics of psychological level below that red line, they generally fall into this bottom area, into this lower area of the circle. I also, as a practitioner, later researched various certificate-based project management and program management change initiatives. And what you find is they generally focus in this top area, so the more rational space. But when you get down here, this is not about being irrational, it's about the psychological safety, the desire to learn, motivation, culture, how a group interacts with each other. Many change initiatives seem to actually fail to take into account belonging to a group and what that means to people at a deep level. And if you're changing the structure, you're changing then the group ownership or who belongs where. And that can cause all sorts of interesting symptoms, which often I would suggest get categorized as resistance to change. Is it really? I would suggest it's not, but it's a fact in this marketplace of change that we really need to deal with, to be aware of. So this concludes really the research part, more the academic research. And so we completed in 2012, and we were left wondering, is there a systemic issue at play? Are the key skills being missed in traditional training for change leaders and practitioners? So I've alluded a little bit to that already. Yet the training at the end of the day is meant to share essential knowledge so skill and understanding can be developed. And the challenge I put out into the marketplace, but does it? My feeling is, in many cases, it doesn't. So here we are in 2015. So our thinking's moved on after a couple of years. And we've used a different color specifically, so we're into a new period here. This is the model that we've seen before, the organizational dynamics model in the top right-hand side. And what I came to realize is there are other factors at play which really impact the space that the organization or change initiative is operating within. If I come first of all over to the left-hand side, top left, we have multiple intelligences. Back to 1983, there's some work published about multiple intelligences. What's interesting about that is certain areas are focused on in the traditional education system, and even as you go through into business school development. So some of these multiple intelligences that might be helpful for change in organizational space, I would suggest or posit that some are not necessarily dealt with in the learning and development space that we typically have available to us. The bottom left, this is about the transition curve. This is now about psychological transition. So a cycle that people typically go through when they're having to experience major change. Often the only thing that's different between any two people is how deep is this dip in terms of their energy level and focus. Here we can see people are quite happy. We've got some change coming along. They go through all sorts of emotional states. Some can get locked in depression and can stay down there for quite a long time. But generally people will come through to accept and then move forward. The challenge that we have is this depth will vary by individual. This time period will vary by individual. Quite a complex concept if you haven't seen it before, but if you map it to some of your own personal changes in life, because this applies actually to any aspect of life, I would suggest, suddenly joining a new company, there's a period where you don't feel you belong, and then one day you stop thinking and you do belong. Well, that's you going through this sort of cycle. Now, bottom right-hand side, what we have is an eco-cycle. This is developed by a gentleman in America called David Hurst, and we've taken it on board and we've adapted it slightly to make the language more appropriate for the space we operate in. But there's the life cycle that we often know about in companies. You can think about this first part. This is about performing, and we're pretty familiar about how do we make our organizations perform more effectively. Can we do it? It's another matter, but we know it's a desire. But organizations come through a point where actually they have to almost reinvent themselves, and there's a period of confusion, and then you come through, then you have to create new ideas. In terms of large companies that have been through this cycle pretty publicly, think of IBM over the years when they shifted from a hardware company to a services company, also Apple Computers. There are many examples, and you can apply this dynamic, interesting enough, to a person's career, to a company, to an industry, and I'd assert even maybe at a country level. So these dynamics are taking place along with this organizational model, but there's yet another area that complicates this space. And if you start to get a grasp of these models, it becomes easier to understand what's really going on. I use this image in the middle to represent this. It's about what I refer to as an integrative leadership framework, and this is about whatever your role in the company, be aware there are at least 3 major perspectives at play, and we'll talk about that as we go further forward. So let's start with the multiple intelligences. I won't read this out because, again, you'll have reference to it, but the chap who developed this theory was a Harvard professor called Howard Gardner. This is the multiple intelligences cycle that we've created, and what you find here is this area to the left, so picture, number, and word smart. So for the word smart, think intelligences. That's the classic education space that most countries will provide as part of their education program for youngsters coming through, and then into college. And then what tends to happen is people then start to specialize at some point, where they'll maybe focus on music, or body smart would be elite sports people, ballet dancers, all sorts of kinesthetic or physical, understanding where your body is in space and time. Divers, highboard divers is a lovely example of body smart. They know where they are in time and space when they're traveling through from the board into the water. But what's fascinating, the self-smart, which is about awareness of oneself, and people-smart, is actually an area that you don't find in many, many training initiatives. And I would suggest that for many people, there's actually a blind spot in this space. Now, people later on in life may come to it, but they've probably been 20 to 30 years in business. And my challenge is, I wonder if we were to introduce the people smarts and the self-smart area, develop those intelligences earlier, might that actually help us in the change initiatives? This is the model again, the organizational dynamics model. Again, just reinforcing the point that we've got a line here. How well can you work above the line? So it's a question for yourself as you consider these areas. How well are you trained? And my guess is if you've gone through formal training, this area is going to be pretty good. Now the question is, but how well can you work below the line? Do you have a sense of what personal dynamics are, what really motivation is about, and how you can formulaically understand it to an extent to then unpick what's happening in front of you in a group? And then moving actually into the group space, the intra and intergroup dynamics. So that's within the group and between groups, the relationships that are in play there. And remember, this is where the majority of the challenge areas came in the symptoms for change. We've spoken a little bit about this. I'm not going to do any further work on here. There's quite a lot of reading material available. If you're interested in it, feel free to contact me and I'll point you in the direction of various books that you can invest in to explore this space more deeply. Same applies here. This is a David Hurst's book. The book he published was called Crisis and Renewal. He has actually got a subsequent book out which is talking about a particular method of how to navigate this particular cycle. It's a very good read. I personally don't use it as part of my core work, but it's an extremely good book if you just want to engage in this on your own and start to internalize some of these challenges that we face. Okay, back to the understanding motivation and modes of management. So let's move on to that area. What I've found in the motivational space, there's some lovely work by a chap called Daniel Pink, and he talks about drive and what's in, and his reference will be available on the next slide. And he talks about the need for there to be clear purpose. This is at an individual level and a group level and an organizational level, so this needs to track right the way through. Do you understand the purpose and why you're doing what you're doing, whatever it is? Do you have a sense of mastery, the ability that you can do it to the competency that you are comfortable with? And autonomy, do you have the level of control? that makes you feel comfortable that you're not out of your depth. You might be being stretched, but you have enough control. So there's an interplay, a dynamic relationship between autonomy, mastery, and purpose here. What is, I find amazing, this is actually a picture of Daniel Pink. This is a screenshot of his webinar, which if you have access, you can get to TED Talks, and this is the link. It's an 18-minute video. If you have an opportunity, I really recommend you look at this. He's got other forms of communicating the same message. His drive motivational theory is actually not his. He's simplified it for us so it makes it much more accessible. It comes from a theory called self-deterministic theory, and I can point people who like the more academic path in the direction of that as well, but they are consistent because one is formed from the other. But look at this top piece here in the screen. There is a mismatch between what science knows and what business does. And what I found so amazing as I've gone through this, both first academic and then practitioner research, is there really is, and it's not just here in the motivational space, there really is a mismatch between what we know and what we share and what we do. And I've yet to understand fully why. So this is my attempt to try and share some of the insights we've gained over the past 5 years. I mentioned modes of management. There are many different models and frameworks that talk about stages or levels of management. At one level, they're all saying the same thing, slightly differently, using different language. But I found that when talking to people, the concepts are really a bit of a jump. So I've come up with this very simplified method, which says, look, imagine in an organization, when you're looking at managing any activity or people, resources, imagine that you have a contributor mode, or an achiever mode, or an integrator mode. The contributor is about delivering what's being asked by the organization, no more, no less. The achiever mode is about doing more than what's asked. The integrator is actually not just thinking about the organization, but the extended stakeholders. The term triple bottom line reporting, thinking of people, profit, and planet, is one term that it captures that. Corporate social responsibility is another. You generally find CEOs of organizations need to be operating in the achiever mode because it's about delivery, short-term events. But you need balance, you need contributors and you need integrators in the mix. Sometimes they can be the same person, but I would suggest that's a rare mix. So now you get down to the dynamics of a team. Do you have the right team players in play such they can complement each other? On a board of a company, I personally would recommend that you have an achiever in the CEO space and an integrator, at least one or two on the board, and maybe even the chairperson would be the best integrator, because this is about longer-term strategy, and this is about short-term results. They can't fight, they have to coexist because both are important. One for survival today, one for survival for tomorrow. You can take these modes of management here, the contributor, the achiever, the integrator, and you can then say, well, actually, what about the context? Too often we miss the context in how we're assessing a particular space. So again, to try and make it manageable, I've said, well, let's think about this. Where might you be focusing in a change initiative? Are you focusing at changing at the individual level, i.e. a person or individual people? Or are you looking at a team or group, actually, you can think of this, or organizational level? Because this sets at one level the level of focus. You could argue the level of complexity is equal in each if you dig deep enough into any of the disciplines. But where do you want to focus? Individual change, team change, organizational change? Which predominant mode of management is in play for that particular space? And the reason is, set it down here, the modes of management are in play. It's whatever modes of management are in play in your change program, you want to know, are the right people sitting in the most appropriate seats? And because right in the middle, each mode will perceive the same data differently. That came out in my early research in the 2012 project, where several of my interviewees answered the question not just slightly differently, they answered it from a completely different vantage point or perspective. And I started to realize there's actually significant implications. If you have change leaders who are operating predominantly at the integrator mode, they're going to see different things to maybe someone operating at the contributor mode. And that will directly impact the behaviors and the change initiative that's taken on by the organization. And if you are not conscious of these modes in operation, there's a high probability you're going to have a mismatch between what you're trying to do and what actually happens. People. Again, where do you start and where do you stop when you look at the people space? I've tried to, again, bring this back to areas that are accessible to us, that we can relate to, but maybe haven't put so much focus on. And what I've concluded, again, I've been validating this in the practitioner research, again, making sure it maps back to other reports that are out there, and ensuring that I'm not actually inadvertently projecting a wrong representation here. Ask yourself, do you know, or the people who are involved in change, do they know how to create compatible teams? Do they have a method, a clear process? My experience has been most organizations and most individuals don't actually have a clear process for this. I work with the Chartered Institute of Personal Development in some of their special interest groups, and even some of the HR professionals I work in, a high percentage of them don't know how to answer the question, how do you create a compatible team? So that's a question to ask yourself. Do you know how to do that? If not, it's worth finding out how to, because it will help you immensely. Managing conflict. Human beings have different opinions, have different perspectives. There will always be conflicting views and ideas and recommendations. The question is, do you know collectively how to manage it productively? Because I would suggest that most of the most creative ideas come from productive managed conflict. So you need those different ideas, because that's where the spark comes. But if people are afraid of dealing with conflict and they hide the issues under the table, which unfortunately in the UK is a known phenomenon based on several research papers from the Chartered Institute of Personal Development, then what happens is you end up creating a sub-optimized organization. Now imagine you're putting it through a major change initiative. Why would we expect the change initiative to be successful if we don't know how to actually manage relationships effectively in a conflicting scenario? And then finally, managing resistance. So the very topic we started with. I would suggest that if you understand what the symptom of resistance is, you generally can work with people to discover readiness. But if you stay at the space of people are resistant, I would suggest in 10 years' time, you'll still be seeing 70% failure rates, or not succeeding as much as we'd like from the stakeholders. I wanted to bring slightly different perspective for each of these points. So we've got the compatible teams, managing conflict, managing resistance. But to give you another view, not just my view, but where you can see how this starts to form really an interesting holistic picture. In the past few weeks, there's a great report. It's called the CEO report. It's published by Said Business School in Oxford. And it talks about embracing the paradoxes of leadership and the power of doubt. It's a lovely read. I recommend you get it. You can download it from this URL that I've included. It's a free download. I don't think you even have to register. I think you just pull it straight down. And it talks about some key elements that I've highlighted here. You know, CEOs need to understand the softer skills. That's what we've been talking about. Systemic thinkers, that's the organizational dynamic model that we've been talking about. A time of constant change. Think of the eco-cycle, think of the psychological model. Communications needs to be modified, taking into account context. If you don't, people won't necessarily hear the message you're wanting to share. Too often we hear, well, we've told everyone, they just don't seem to understand. Maybe the communication is not so effective. Maybe actually what's happened is it's broadcasting rather than true two-way communication. You need two-way communication to make sure your thoughts and ideas have been understood. So, other areas we mentioned earlier on, multiple intelligences, and we said self-smart and people-smart. Self-awareness is an example of self-smart. So what you can see here is from a great report from Said, and I can't remember the number of CEOs, but it's a large number of CEOs globally that they've been interviewing. The same thing is coming up again. This is a tool that we've created. It's available free of charge. At the end of the PowerPoint, there's the link to download it if you want. This is just one way of being able to plot how an individual member of a team, so each of these dots represents individual members, how they experience the team that they are a member of. We're not measuring people here. We're having people measuring the system, the group that they are part of, or the team they're part of. There is no right and wrong place. But if you don't know where people are and people don't know where others are, the probability of miscommunication is very, very high. So develop mechanisms to understand and help people understand where other people perceive and how they perceive the existence in a particular team or group. Next one, point 2, we're now looking at the managing conflict space. I've mentioned multiple intelligence quite a lot. Well, Howard Gardner is the author. He's got a book he published, I think that's 2000. Yes, it is 2000 published. What's really interesting is he makes some lovely points in his book. I recommend, if you're interested in space, invest in that book. And if you start to understand the items and concepts he's talking about, you'll start to understand how to productively manage conflict. Again, that's beyond the scope of today. Again, a tool, and actually it's the same tool as one we've already mentioned. It's part of that tool set. We come now to here. Wonderful writer, he's no longer with us, I'm afraid. He died some years ago, Chris Argyris on the right-hand side. He has a paper called Teaching Smart People How to Learn. If you search it, you should be able to find a link to download a copy, or you can also obtain it from Harvard Business Review. But effectively, in this paper, he talks about 2 areas, mutual learning and unilateral control. Well, what we've done from our research is we've then actually further taken that and broken it down to areas that we think are representative in a change space. And this is a classic dial where you would see a score for how much asking goes on versus telling. How are people open, or are they closed? Do you explore multiple views, or actually, no, it's only my view that counts? Is there manipulation or collaboration, collective behavior or individual behavior? Understanding is quite high versus misunderstanding. Mistrust and trust. Enhanced working life or degraded working life. It's a very, very simple profile, but it's built on the insights gained by reading this type of work. It's not just this paper, but that paper is a great start for people. Managing change. This whole webinar is about resistance to change. There's a lovely book here again on the left, Business Change Management, and just read this section in the middle. You know, managing resistance is difficult because it's centered on human factors for which skills and experience in organizations are in limited supply. Most managers and business professionals are products of their prevailing management paradigm, one that has not significantly evolved since the beginning of the 20th century. Just think about that for a minute. We are products of the very system we've come through. Therefore, our beliefs and understandings will have been informed by that. What if they weren't complete? What if there is more to evolve here? And then the bit that's bolded, you know, this mindset emphasizes the financial and structural aspects of organizations over the human aspects, and it is therefore ill-equipped to deal with human resistance. If you understand human resistance, it becomes the ability to help people to become ready by knowing what you need to do, not to manipulate, but to support, to enable the learning. The last part of that instrument that you can download if you wish is a view that allows you to look at, actually, it's called Team Potential here in Readiness for Innovation, but in reality, maybe a better term is organizational character. It's, well, what does the organization feel like to people? Is it collaborative? Are the communications good? Do people, are they allowed to explore choices? Is feedback seen as a good thing or a bad thing? What's motivation like in the organization? What about personal development? These first 6 areas are formed from self-deterministic theory. And if you reflect back to the first few slides, we had human motivation and drive. So that, if you like the Daniel Pink material on drive, if you feel it, if it resonates for you, then if you think, well, actually, I like to go even deeper, then you can go into self-deterministic theory. And what we've done is this paper takes self-deterministic theory and applies it in the organizational setting. So we then said, okay, let's look at our resistance to change symptoms. How many of those do we think would have been addressed if what's proposed in this paper were in play? And then what we discovered was, well, an awful lot were, but there were some that were not. So we then went back to, okay, so what items are coming out in our organizational dynamics model? And we added 4 items. So there's 10 items that we explore here through the questionnaire. So what to do starting next week? So we're moving to the wrapping up point to move to Q&A very, very shortly. Try to ask yourself, you know, do you and your change leaders, depending on where you are in the organization, do they have a good sense of what motivation is really about? And this is obviously impacted culturally as well, so one has to put it in the context of the national culture. What about the interpersonal space? Do people understand that? Some of these things will actually transcend culture and some will not. Modes of management. As you think through the lens of modes of management, does that change how you might engage in the change phase? And really what I would suggest is integrative leadership for us. What does it mean? Well, it means that you can hold these concepts in mind all the time. It'll take some time to absorb them, but they're all at play all the time. What mode of management is predominantly at play in you and in others? Can people switch to different modes? Absolutely, but do they? What form of motivation is in play for an individual, for a group, for a company or a division? Think in terms of mergers and acquisitions. That will impact the motivational setting because purpose may be questioned, mastery may be questioned. People who have been very competent at doing what they've been doing for years may suddenly need to do a new job. They may no longer feel competent. Do they feel they have control of what's going to happen next to an extent that doesn't make them less effective? And then finally, the people space. Do we understand how to create compatible teams, productively manage conflict, and understand that if we can manage resistance, we can actually move to this space of creating readiness? Okay, I won't spend time here. I'll just flag them for you because I want to wrap up now. What we have in the additional resources, I've sort of been flagging them slightly for early on. We have an audit that is a PDF document that you can download and you can complete it and you don't need to share it with anyone else. That's the first item. There's an online version of this called Project Climate that we're doing some work with the Association of Project Managers with. You can enter data in there and you can see a live infographic, and then there's a growth through change self-assessment. So that's the first item, and there's the link to download. Those with smartphones, you can scan that code. It's a document like this you'll be expecting. So it's 15 minutes and 35 questions. This is the online audit. Again, the link for that. Same profile, just delivered differently, but here's the infographic that will build as people contribute. And this is the organizational dynamics. It's a slightly different format to what you've seen so far, but there's a very different Q&A type self-discovery at the organizational level here. And that leaves me to say thank you very much for your interest in being online today, and I'll be very happy to field any questions that come to the fore.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Willis. Folks, we are open for the question and answers now. If you have any questions, you could put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, on the right side of your screen. You'll see the webinar console. So you click on the hand icon, and I will unmute your microphone so you can speak directly with Mr. Willis. Let me go straight to the question box. There are a couple of questions. Being the first one, Mr. Willis, loss of job seems to be one of the main reasons why employees normally resist to any change drive. What communication strategy would you suggest in order to come over such a fear of job loss before initiating any change implementation?
Well, that's a lovely one. Let me share an experience I actually had, and hopefully that will make it real for you. Every one of these situations is unique, so to give a generic answer is problematic, but I think there are some positioning answers that would help. I was in charge of a post-integration project where we had a European technical team, and after the merger of these two international organizations, we knew we had to halve, so we had to reduce by 50% the workforce. So that was a fact. It was a business fact. The two companies coming together, some of the products that were acquired were going to be divested, going to be sold off. The technical team were required to support the products that we were no longer going to have in the organization. And just to make it further complicated, the divestment or selling off of the various product lines was going to occur over an 18-month period. So imagine this situation. You have a pan-European technical team that is made up of roughly 1/3 of one organization, actually the acquiring organization, and 2/3 the acquired organization. And over 18 months, that total group has to be half the size. And that was my challenge, how to achieve that. Now, I have to say, this was probably the birth of me approaching business in a very different way. My background is an electronics engineer, and I've been involved in P&L management for many, many years. So the classic rational space of, well, it's obvious we have to make these changes. And so the rational part of me was clear. we knew we had to halve the organization by the time we had sold off the identified range of products. But then a part of me said, so how do you make sure that what's left in 18 months is worth having? Because if you have this situation where half of the organization is going to go, people are going to think, well, why should I be here? Or I'm going to stay here, but I'm scared. And I knew I needed positive support from people, also knowing that the people I would be getting support from may not be left in the organization by the time we had finished the project. So what I chose to do, it took me a couple of weeks to get my head around this because it was a very challenging issue. And bear in mind, we're talking of 50% job loss here. I basically went to each of our European offices, so there are 4 offices, and I met with each office, and I said, look, here is the reality. In 18 months, this technical team across Europe will be half the size. At first, I had, you can imagine, quite an interesting reaction from people. And I made the point that it is a business reality. Now, if I am there or not, it doesn't matter. It will happen because the products will be sold. The technical resources will not be needed, and therefore people will lose their jobs. So the one thing I offered people was within, obviously there's national regulations I had to respect in terms of reducing headcount, but I said, with it, notwithstanding the legal requirements that I have to adhere to, I will be as transparent and as open with the entire group as it is possible for me to be so. So I would then, once I'd gone around and I'd shared, if you like, the shock treatment, which was this is going to happen, so no one's hiding anything. What we didn't know, of course, was the implementation. Who would be impacted? And then what I did is I laid out a methodology, which was we're going to look at revenue alignment, we're going to look at the products that we know are going to stay, we're going to look at the geography of where people are. We explicitly would not take into account were they part of the acquiring or acquired company. That would have been very dangerous if we had done that. So we looked at the total pool and we selected it in a very rational way. Now, the challenge that we had was obviously we didn't know when each product line was being sold. We knew the projected timeline. So by being open with people, what I found happened, and it was this phenomena that changed me to explore, I need to go and understand behavioral change and the psychology of change. I would say I had 90% support from that entire group in delivering the reality of reducing the workforce by 50%. And what's really interesting, that was 10 years ago. The group that was left is still there and is still creating record profits. And the people who left the company look back and say, we were part of that success. So actually, it's a very nice story created through people understanding there was an imperative to change. It wasn't false, it was a real one. So you hear the burning bridges scenario. The burning bridges scenario is a lovely one if it's real. Don't create false burning bridges. They will always backfire on you. So I hope that helps. Hello?
Corporate. And if you may know, there is a takeover from Halliburton over my company. It is similar to the case you've just talked about. The takeover will happen in like 6 months from now. How should managers react to their employees?
Well, I think there's, if there's known facts, the question is how much is known and isn't known. It's not about scaring people. Remember, one of the issues about the changing is people need not to be scared. Now, does that mean they will definitely keep their jobs? No, you can't guarantee that. In this situation, the person that guarantees someone has a job generally ends up being disappointed somewhere along the line. So I would say it depends on the specific circumstances. I'm happy to talk offline, but generally it's a case of as information becomes clear, share it internally as soon as you possibly can, because what I found was by having people engage in the process, they provided more information for me, and it wasn't the case they were canvassing for jobs, it was real data they were providing. And what I think happens in too many organizations when you have a major transition taking place, everyone goes into a defensive mechanism and they keep quiet and they keep their heads down. And including, by the way, some of the senior management team. It's a fairly typical response. Unfortunately, the byproduct of that is often it's the senior management team that are making the decisions. we have often heard that it's true in so many companies that the senior management team doesn't actually know what's happening at the front end, the client-facing side. So if you don't enable a communication channel to be effective, then some people probably will be asked to leave, which may be completely unnecessary because of their contribution was not understood. So I think it's about acknowledging if you have two companies come together, does it mean definitely people will leave? It depends on the business circumstance. If the numbers clearly say, yes, there's too many people, then you know some people are going to leave. So make that statement. Try to scale it though. You know, is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? You want people to have a sense of the magnitude. And then enable people as best you can to provide data. And it's a really interesting balance. This is not people being scared to fight for their job, because that will create misinformation. It's about saying, if you can provide real data to help us understand the business, and by the way, it requires the leadership team to be humble and expect that actually maybe they don't understand the business fully. That will vary by context, clearly, and by company. But if you can get that discussion going, the important point is whoever is left will want to be there, and whoever moves on will feel much stronger, a sense of mastery and autonomy. Autonomy is about control. They feel they have more control of their destiny. There's nothing worse than feeling you have no control. And if you have no control, which is often induced by poor communication, if you don't know what's happening, you know a takeover's happened because you see it publicly. If you then have no other information, fear gets created. Lack of control is believed. Defense mechanisms kick in. It's called survival. People learn how to survive. Is that in the best interest for everyone in the organization? Often not. And that is one of the interesting dilemmas about this. So my experience has been it's almost as if the very thing you think you shouldn't do is often the thing you should do. But you have to take that advice carefully.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another short question. Okay, it's about the timing. How important is the timing? Don't you think, Mr. Willis, change must be introduced when there are no other major initiatives going on in parallel?
Okay, if you're fortunate enough to be able to manage that, then well done. My experience has been major change comes when you least want it. It's one of those strange phenomena. But I think that there's a part about the timing that I want to pick up on, because it's often not understood. And again, there's a strange topic here. In one of my slides, I didn't highlight it, but the one which links the symptoms back to the organizational dynamics, so that's where I had all the call-out items where you had that line going across. In there was a particular item that had assimilation capacity. Now, assimilation capacity is what's the maximum amount of change that we can take, and the assimilation, taking new information. And so if you think of change creates new information. The assimilation capacity of each individual will be different. Now, when a board or a senior management team has been working on a major change initiative, it generally takes several weeks or months going through and discussing it. Those conversations are generally not available in the internal public domain. But once the team has understood what they want to do, what then typically happens, which again is fascinating, we fall into this trap of assuming once we've sent our email or given a basic communication, everyone else will understand that this makes sense, because with the leadership team, we've gone through, we've really been considering it carefully, and this is the conclusion, this is what we want to do. The problem is, it typically takes the same amount of time that it took the leadership team for the other people you're communicating with to understand what's being asked of them. So if you ask someone to do something and they don't understand, you generally don't get what you're asking. So on the timing front, I think there's two things. The person who raised the question raises for me the challenge of assimilation capacity. Are we asking too much at the same time? Because there is a limit that people can take of too much complexity. By the way, I'm aware my slide set might be pushing that limit in some cases as well. But then, so one is about assimilation capacity, too much. And then the other is, once a group has understood it, don't assume the other people that you're going to communicate with will get it as quickly as you did, because you're in a privileged position if you're in the decision-making group. So other folk may even take longer. So what that means is there is often the need to communicate multiple times in different ways, targeting different areas of the organization. And the organization that fails to take effectively an integrated communication plan into place is one that's likely to get problems because people don't actually understand what's being asked of them.
Well, thank you. We have a supplementary question from Brother Fayez. The question is, Jack Welch says, as a manager, it is your job to make employees happy to be here and ready to leave. How to ensure to make that happen as a manager?
I think it's about empowerment. Go back to the purpose, and let me go back to the slide. Are my slides still showing, by the way? Can I check my slides?
Yes, sir. You still have the rights to show your screen. Absolutely.
Okay. I just want to go back. Right, I've gone back to the drive slide, which is the motivation one. This is fascinating because I absolutely agree with that principle. If you strive to make yourself and your staff strong, then you are mobile, you are agile. And as long as your purpose on the left here, your purpose is aligned to the organizational purpose, there's absolutely no reason why you'd want to consider leaving the company. Your personal mastery is something that I would recommend for many people to continue to develop. You know, some people learn a certain level and then just sit there for their entire lives. That's a life decision. My personal view is, though, if you carry on developing your own mastery in whatever field you have passion with, that will actually help your personal confidence. Because the more mastery you have, and if you're aligned to purpose, you generally can find you can get the appropriate level of autonomy. And for me, a manager's role is, as well as the traditional resource coordination activities that you'd expect from a manager, you know, managing both physical resource as well as the human resource space, I think it's about making sure that your individual team members, or the people that report to you, is their purpose. And this is not about manipulating, it's about enabling. Is their purpose clear to them? It may not be, because we generally don't work in this space very well. Some managers do it intuitively extremely well. I would suggest it's not the majority. As a point, in the UK, there was a research project last year completed, 19 billion pounds, so pounds sterling each year, is estimated to be wasted in the UK economy due to ineffective management practice. So in the UK, we are being very self-critical at the moment, and I would argue that part of that is because we haven't actually enabled the management layer to have access to some of this, what I would refer to as basic knowledge that's been around for years, just not shared. So I love the question, it's great, and I would, whenever I'm looking at a team, I actually start to look at the motivation. Is there alignment? And if there isn't alignment, if you've got a really strong candidate who has the level of control, at one level they're happy, but the purpose is not aligned, at some point they're going to go. So why not make it a positive journey rather than a disruptive one?
Okay, thank you very much. We have what we pressed on time, but we can take one last question. It's about office politics, normally become a hindrance in the change drive as well. What do you recommend in order to manage such employees who are committed to seeing the change effort fail?
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, it absolutely happens. I've shifted my slides now to an item called team readiness. I think there's two things. First is, well, actually there's three steps. The first step is to develop an understanding of what's really going on. I mean, we all seem to be built with a natural antenna that says there's some politics going on. Our biggest problem is we often don't have the language, the vocabulary, or the frameworks to analyze what's going on, so we then don't know how to understand what is actually happening behind the scenes. What's the motivation? And if we fundamentally believe people are bad, then we've got a problem on our hands because we'll never actually find what's really going on. My proposition is fundamentally believe people are good. They want to contribute. So if something's not happening the way you want it to or the way you expect it to, there's a mismatch somewhere. That's all it is. So this is where you get into the, I wonder why this person is behaving or doing what they're doing. this is not about judgment, it's about inquiry. And then one of the reasons we developed this tool is I would start, in fact, the person who's raised that question, I strongly recommend they get hold of a copy of this paper, so the Teaching Smart People How to Learn. Because many of the mechanisms that you see in what I refer to now as the office politics in change get captured by Chris Argyris's paper. He talks about the self-defense mechanisms that we have that make us look as if we don't want to change, but actually what's often behind it is fear. So that's a strong recommendation for that question holder to get that paper. On the left-hand side, what I've tried to do with this very simple questionnaire is to try and say, well, look, when you've got office politics in play, try to complete this profile. Now, if someone's going to complete it and try and manipulate it, there lies a problem. But ask yourself, how is that politicking unfolding? Is it coming out by telling people what's going to happen, or being closed, not sharing, so holding information back? Their view is the only right view. They may be manipulating. Often if you've got politics on, it's an individual view at play. Misunderstandings often occur. So if you can try and say, well, okay, I've got a challenge, where is it manifesting itself? Because underneath each of these, you've now got different items that are probably driving it. And you can always come back to, if someone is not doing what you're expecting, ask yourself, do they have a motivation to do something different? We have issues in the UK with change initiatives, we've already said that a high percentage do not deliver what's expected. The biggest mismatch often is purpose. What the person wants to achieve and what the group needs to achieve and the company needs to achieve are not aligned. The first thing to do is to get that on the table so people understand it. But because we don't know these structures, we generally don't put these topics on the table. Next is to understand what's the predominant mode of operation that they're working at. Are they contributor, achiever, or integrator mode? It will impact how they see the data. If you are operating at achiever mode and that person is operating contributor mode, you will conclude different things from the same data. Therefore, you will do things differently. And then finally, it's by understanding those other areas, you start to understand what compatible teams looks like, how to productively manage conflict. Politicking, very interesting. Managing productively conflict fits in this area as well. So a bit of a long answer, but I would start from get that paper, Teaching Smart People How to Learn. I think it will help.
Well, indeed, very helpful, and thank you very much, Mr. Rod Willis. I really want to thank you on behalf of the Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship for giving us such valuable information. And also, we have receiving a lot of comments from the attendees who are actually appreciating all the slides that you've illustrated and your webinar. So thank you very much. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
If you are able, this is just it's kind of fun slide. If you're able to think in terms of just these 9 items, you've got 3 areas: modes of management, people, and drive, which is motivation, and then these 3 areas below. I'm convinced that if you can hold just those 3 spaces, even if you don't study them, it will help you to deliver more effective change. That's it.
Well, once again, thank you very much, sir, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar and for posing interesting questions, making it an interactive experience for all of us. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on Mile Community, so please stay tuned to community.mile.org, and also to learn about our upcoming programs and webinars, you can check webinar.mile.org to sign up for the new webinars and also to access the archive sections. With that note, I would like to end this webinar.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.